A man emailed me and said he wanted to share his spooky story time about his father, who was a landlord and was renting a unit to a woman who practiced Santeria in the unit, and all the creepy events that followed. I want to add a quick disclaimer that I know nothing about this subject, and I don't mean any offense to any religion. I know that everybody's different and have different beliefs. That said, the man says that he grew up in Louisiana and is used to people believing in hoodoo, voodoo, Santeria, which are all different, but there it's commonly accepted that if somebody practices or believes in something different than you just accept it as their truth. You don't discredit it. He said this is the only unexplained creepy thing that he's ever experienced, though. This man has an apartment building in his family. It's only 4 units. It's not huge. It was passed down from his grandfather to his father, who was landlording at the time. We're calling his father Mr. B for the sake of this story. Mr. B lives in one of the units. His son lives in another unit. They have a long-term tenant named Maria, and the 4th unit opens up. A new tenant comes in. She puts down a large cash deposit. She pays 3 months upfront in cash, and she tells Mr. B that all she needs is privacy and not to be disturbed. Mr. B runs a background check. She's clean. She moves in. He says I can call her Yolanda for the story. He says Yolanda was probably early 60s. She wore long white dresses all the time, white head wraps with sometimes red accents. He says Yolanda at first was nice enough. She was polite, though she was quiet. She didn't talk to him much, though she would greet him in the hallways if they passed each other. And she really didn't leave her unit except for to bring in like large bags of groceries once or twice a week. Soon after Yolanda moves in, the smell of her cooking starts permeating the entire building. It's very, very spice heavy. And they're fine with this, Mr. B and his son. They're like, okay, she's just from a different culture, like it's whatever. But Maria, the other tenant, doesn't like it. And any chance she gets, she goes over to Mr. B's unit and tells him that she can't stand Yolanda and that she's using evil spices. Mr. B's son described him as a very passive elderly man, and he was just always trying to keep the peace. So he tells Maria, look, Maria, you cook all the time. We don't complain about your smells. You know, you can't evict someone for cooking. You're just going to have to get used to it. She's from a different culture. So Maria ends up going back to her unit, mumbling under her breath all the time. One day she comes over to Mr. B's again, and she goes, she's got animals in there. Apparently the building was 2 floors. So Maria and Yolanda shared 1 floor, and then Mr. B and his son shared the other floor. Maria says, I can hear her birds squawking all night. I can't sleep. You need to do something. And the only 2 rules in the building were that there was no smoking allowed and no animals. So Mr. B takes this concern seriously, and he goes down to Yolanda's unit. He's standing outside her door. He knocks. Maria's standing behind him. Yolanda comes to the door, opens the door, and he says he could see past her shoulders, candles lit on every surface, animal skulls, and feathers on the floor. Yolanda quickly steps in front of the door to block his view, but Maria's standing behind him. She starts freaking out. She's like, this woman's evil. She runs back to her unit. Mr. B ignores it and trying to be polite, he says, hey, Yolanda, do you have animals in here? I just want to be clear that there are no animals allowed in the building. And she says, no, I do not. He also said that when Yolanda opened the door, a bunch of smoke, like hazy smoke, billowed out, and it just smelled like burning herbs. But he also warns her that there's no smoking in the building. She says, I don't smoke. So he goes back to his unit. He's feeling good about it. He figures if she does have animals in there, at least being warned, she'll get rid of them. The next day, Mr. B's son is leaving the building. He notices on his floor, on the 2nd floor, they have a long mirror in the hallway, and that mirror has spiderweb cracks all over it, but it was like somebody took care not to break the whole thing. He figures it's a fluke. He goes down to the 1st floor, and he sees that the long mirror on that hallway is also cracked. Spiderweb cracks, same thing. He tells Mr. B, and Mr. B is like, okay, we'll get him replaced. Doesn't think anything of it. That night around 11 p.m., there's a large commotion coming from the 1st floor. So Mr. B and his son go down to the 1st floor to figure out what's going on, and they find Maria crying, screaming, speaking Spanish at Yolanda. And Maria is claiming that Yolanda has placed a hex on her and broken all the mirrors in her unit. Yolanda is standing outside of her unit, very calmly, just staring at Maria, and she just tells Mr. B, I don't know what she's saying. Mr. B calms Maria down. He says, there's no way she could get into your unit. She didn't break her mirrors. I don't know what happened. Maybe the building moved. Again, just trying to keep the peace. Maria freaks out, runs into her apartment, and comes back out with a crucifix and what his son described as probably a vial of holy water. She points this at Yolanda, and Yolanda projectile vomits all over the floor. Mr. B quickly runs to Yolanda's aid. He says, are you okay? She says, I'm not feeling well. I need to go to bed. Keep in mind, Mr. B is elderly, so his son goes to get things to clean up the hallway. While Mr. B's son is cleaning up the mess, Maria comes back outside of her unit. She grabs him by the shoulder. She shakes him, and she says, you need to get rid of her. You have no idea what she invited into this building. Next day, Mr. B's son is over at his unit. They're trying to figure out what to do about Maria and Yolanda not getting along, and Mr. B starts complaining that he doesn't feel well and tells his son that they're going to have to talk about it another time because he's going to go to sleep. As Mr. B's son is leaving, Yolanda shows up at the door, and she's got a pot of something in her hands, and she tells Mr. B, I know you're not feeling well. I think something's going around. This always helps me and people in my culture feel better, and she hands him what he describes as a stew. Mr. B says, thank you. She says, no, eat some now. You'll feel better. So Mr. B and his son go back in the unit. Mr. B's son is like, I don't know if you should eat that. And he's like, no, she's just being nice. She's trying to keep the peace. He takes a bite. His son's like, how is it? And he's like, oh, it's good. It's different. And he said there were chunks of meat in it. It was very spice heavy, and there was a slight metallic taste. That night, Mr. B is violently ill, but he feels better the next day. It's not long before Maria is back complaining about a sour smell coming from Yolanda's unit. Mr. B and his son had also noticed it from their floor, but they didn't want to be rude. They didn't know if it had to do with her cooking, but at this point, the smell was too much to ignore. Maria keeps telling them that she has something dead in there, so they go back to her unit. Mr. B and his son knock on the door. Yolanda comes to the door, and they said when she opened the door, the scent was overpowering. It was like somebody had left rotting meat in the sun for days. They also see on the wall she has drawn strange symbols in a brown substance that looked like arrows and circles. Mr. B says, Yolanda, you got to take care of the smell in here. I don't know what that is, but it's repulsive. You got to get rid of it. She just stares at him with this blank look, and she says, I've been cleaning. I'll take care of it. She also tells him that one of the tenants of her signing the lease there and paying upfront in cash was that she does not want to be disturbed. Mr. B at that point takes a firmer stance, and his son said that he never saw him really get firm with anybody, but he says, I wouldn't have to keep coming down here if there weren't constantly issues from your unit. Yolanda just stares at him and closes the door in his face, and they're both a little mad, so they go back to their unit. They were only back in their own units for a little while when Maria shows up again on their floor, and she's crying, banging on both of their doors. They come out. She's carrying on and on again. She leads them to her floor, and outside of her door is a dead dove, which appears to have been burned alive. Mr. B starts clutching his chest. He's having chest pains. They go back up to his unit. His son is very concerned at this point that the stress of all this is going to have negative effects on Mr. B's health, so he calls the ambulance. They come check him out. They clear him. They tell him to take it easy, but Mr. B's son decides that they need to evict Yolanda because all of this is too much. He also noted at this point in his email that although Maria was not like a close friend, she'd been a tenant of theirs for 12 years and they trusted her. They had no issues with her other than her being on occasion a little bit dramatic, but nothing to this extent. So Mr. B's son decides that he's going to have a conversation with him the next day about getting rid of Yolanda. In the morning, there's a knock on Mr. B's son's door. It's Mr. B. He comes in and he is just beside himself and he's really, really moved and upset. He tells his son that he had a dream of his late wife. Mr. B was a widower who had lost his wife 7 years prior to cancer. And his wife, Luann, was a deeply religious woman. He loved her very much and always said that she was the light to his dark. He tells his son that Luann appeared to him in a dream. He never dreamed of her, even though he wanted to. And Luann was on the end of his bed, and she told him that he should not evict Yolanda. He asked her what she was talking about, and she said, I don't know what she's doing, but you're safer with her than without her. And then she disappeared. And Mr. B was very shaken, very visibly upset, because he said, why would she come to me in a dream to talk to me about Yolanda? I've been waiting for her all this time. Mr. B's son is like, that's enough. We've had it. It's affecting your psyche now. And he convinces Mr. B that they're going to evict her today. He gets the paperwork drawn up. He prorates the amount so they can give her back some money because she hasn't even been there for 3 months at this point. And they go down and serve her with a 30-day notice. Yolanda is very calm when they tell her. She says, it's fine. I'll leave within the week. She says, I have to tell you, by getting rid of me, you're not fixing the problem. Whatever you're afraid of is already here. Within the week, Yolanda is moving out. A friend comes to help her get her stuff. They pack up an old rusty brown van. Mr. B goes down to check out the unit, and it's clean except for a small strand of black beads that was left with a note from Yolanda that said, my gift to you. Mr. B shows his son, and they throw it in the trash. 1 month later, Mr. B was diagnosed with stage 4 emphysema. He was never a smoker, and he passed away 3 months after that. Mr. B's son continued living in and landlording the building for the next year, but he said unexplained things happened all the time. For example, any mirror that he would put in the building would break within days, and try as he might, he could not find anybody to rent Yolanda's unit. Within that year, Maria also fell extremely ill. Even though she was an otherwise healthy woman, her adult daughter ended up taking her to move in with her. He says they didn't keep in touch. He doesn't know how she ended up doing, but he eventually sold the building. He says since moving, he has not had anything strange happen to him, but you can't convince him that Yolanda didn't have a hand in his father's untimely death. He actually said that he's doing well these days, but his takeaway from the experience is that even if you don't believe in something, that doesn't mean it's not real. Keep sending me your spooky, scary stories. I'll keep adding them to this playlist, and I have polls on my Insta every day where you can vote on the next story. Y'all actually voted on this one, so I hope I did it justice.